And of course, I often talk about this. The European talks about freedom of speech. But we are only free to speak when our audience does not hear us. We are only free to speak when our audience is not interested. We are only free to speak when the audience really does not listen. Oh, I can sit here and call Reagan all kind of name and talk about white folk. That illustrates what a great system we have here. But how is this possible? To a good extent, it's possible because, you see, at first you induce the audience not to be what? Interested, not to care or to be apathetic, and then you just let the person speak as long as they want to. You induce the audience not to be active, and therefore, knowing that after the speech is over, no real activity will take place, so you let them talk as much as they want to. So the system of slavery, you see, and Jim Crowism that occurred shortly thereafter structured the black personality in such a way that despite the Marcus Garveys and the Malcolm X's and other people, there's been relatively little change because the reception often of the audiences was such that they would not threaten the United States after they heard the speech. We are only free in this country to do the wrong thing. Recognize what happened to Farrakhan. Farrakhan has been saying the same thing for 20 years. But to a good extent, when the whites actually thought that black people might really be listening to Farrakhan, might really act upon what Farrakhan was saying, he can't now get into Javits Center. Now he's having a hard time finding a place to speak and a platform to speak to black people. Is this the country of free speech, ladies and gentlemen? You better not believe it. There's no way. We say we are free. What is freedom, we say? Freedom to do what we want to do. But stop a minute and think. What makes you want to do what you want to do? And you might come to realize then that our very wants and our very desires have been what? Induced. So that the things we really want and the things we really desire are those things that maintain the system and are those things that destroy us as a people. But yet we object to anyone speaking about it because we see our indulgence in them as some expression of our what? Freedom. Yet in this system, when you so-called let people free, and yet you must maintain them in subordination, they must then, with their freedom of choice, always choose what? The wrong thing. But you give them a foolish pride into thinking that since they have choice, they are therefore free. A very slick system. It induces the captive African to behave in such a way such that he will economically and otherwise and apparently of his own accord support the European establishment to the detriment of his own without being conscious of his doing so. Why should a black person be made to feel ugly? What is the function of associating blackness and ugliness? Blackness and uncleanliness? Blackness and of being unlovable? Is it just purely a racist attitude of some evil people? What do you do when you feel ugly or unkempt? But you do something else beside that. You go out and you buy yourself a new and spend a lot of money. But what's happening here? Who do you spend it with? Who gets the bulk of the money that's spent? In other words, the African feeling ugly and unclean in his attempt to compensate for that feeling of ugliness and uncleanliness goes to the very person who made him feel that way in the beginning and purchases and buys from that person and therefore maintains the very individual to destroy the self-image to start with. Do you think then an economic system that depends upon a bunch of people trying to compensate for feelings of inferiority by buying brand names? I don't know where brands, by buying names of other people on their clothing? Do you think that system is ever really going to let you out of that feeling of ugliness? It can't. It's economically dependent upon that feeling, ladies and gentlemen. If we were made to feel naturally beautiful, don't you know we would destroy the cosmetics and industry? So we must feel naturally that nature itself has not made us beautiful, so that we must compensate for it. And therefore we can see then that the inducement of inferiority in black people, the inducement of a feeling of ugliness, the inducement of these various negative feelings must stay in black people, so that in trying to compensate for these feelings, black people will economically, politically, and otherwise support the very people that induced them. You see, the alienation of black people to be in the state that we are in today as people, we have to be out of our minds. We literally have to be crazy. It is necessary for us to be crazy. It is in order for us to be in the state that we are in today as people, we have to be out of our minds. We literally have to be crazy. It is necessary for us to be crazy. It is necessary for us to be backwards. It is necessary for us to be maladjusted. It is necessary for us to be disunited. It is necessary for us to be self-hating. It is necessary for us to be filled with an inferiority complex. In a world where the European is essentially about 10% of the world's population, if that 10% is to continue to rule over the other 90%, it must keep that 90% out of its mind. It must keep that 90% in a state of deception. It must keep that 90% filled with a feeling of powerlessness and incompetence. If this 10% is to continue to consume more than 60% of the world's resources, if this 10% is to continue to rob African, Asian, and other nations of their material wealth, then it must keep those people in a state of maladjustment. And this implies then that no matter how much integration you may bring about, the feeling of inferiority must be a constant in the black personality. No matter how many people you run for president, no matter how many mayors you get elected, no matter how many people you get on the board of IBM and the others, the basic sense of inferiority, the basic sense of dependency must remain a constant in the black mind. And I will indicate this, and I think this study, which occurred now some 40 years later, shows this to be the case. Dr. Clark shows surprise that after all of this time, this feeling is still there. I would not, and I don't think any student who's basically looked at the necessity of black people being out of their minds as being the foundation of European dominance would not be surprised. We can see then that the inducement of inferiority in black people, the inducement of a feeling of ugliness, the inducement of these various negative feelings must stay in black people, so that in trying to compensate for these feelings, black people will economically, politically, and otherwise support the very people that induced them. You see, the alienation of black people is economically functional. It's just not a feeling you have in your mind. The fact that you may wrestle with your own self-estrangement, separation from yourself, is not just a feeling you're having within yourself. It is a politically functional feeling. It is induced for political purposes. What does it mean to be alienated? To be alienated does not only mean that one suffers a split within the personality, that one feels estranged from himself, that one does not know himself. Certainly that's an aspect of alienation, and this is the way it's talked about in the psychology books, you see. And when you read all of the psychology, you think you're really getting heavy, you see, and the Eurocentrics teach it to you very directly, and you feel very profound. When you talk about the great dynamics of the head and ego struggling with one another. Why do you alienate a person? We are alienated so that we can serve aliens. That is the function of alienation. Alienation means to be determined by forces outside oneself, other than oneself, to the enhancement of those aliens. When Marx talks about alienation, then do not just cue in on the alienation that the worker feels. Recognize that the worker has to be alienated in order to serve the owner of the means of production. That's its ultimate function. You will recognize then, an alienated people can only spend money with aliens. They can only support aliens. They can sit here and support these Koreans and these Arabs and these Indians and everybody else but a black person. They can support everybody's families but their own. They can give jobs to these people's uncles and aunts and sisters and brothers and children, but they cannot give jobs to their own children. They can feel good when they give all of their money to Bloomingdale's and these other places, but they feel cheated every time they trade with the black person. You have to be alienated for that reason. That's why we alienate. And do you think the right man intends to turn that feeling of alienation loose in your heart? You are dead wrong. No matter how often you go into a boardroom, no matter how high you move up into the white hierarchy, because alienation is functional for white power and functional for white economic, social, and political dominance. And yet I see somebody expressing surprise after 40 years that black children still have a sense of inferiority because you don't know your black psychology and because you studied them from a Eurocentric psychological point of view. And because you saw your goal as not removing the white man from power, but of sleeping with them in their beds.